Welcome to Selling Secrets, the show about action movies and spy films. Our mission is to look at the movies we love and go behind the scenes to find out what makes a successful Hollywood blockbuster. From interviews to movie reviews, marketing campaign analysis, and more, Selling Secrets is your home of spy films and action movies. Do you know what it takes to make a Hollywood blockbuster successful? Let's find out together on Selling Secrets. Hello and welcome to Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Since the early days of Hollywood, book-to-film adaptations have been a popular medium. They're inherently popular because they can market themselves based on the book's success and existing fan base. However, just because a book is successful and popular, that doesn't mean the book-to-film adaptation is as successful or popular. For every Casino Royale, Bourne Identity, or 3 Days of the Condor, there's a Casino Royale 1967, Alex Rider Stormbreaker, or Never Say Never Again. So, I wanted to dive in to what makes a successful book-to-film adaptation, and also look at what makes maybe not such a successful adaptation. However, I'm not an author, so to help me unpack this topic, I needed to bring someone on who is undoubtedly more successful and adept in writing a novel than I am. So joining me today for his second time on Selling Secrets is best-selling romance and adventure author Roland Hulme. For those who haven't listened to my first interview with Roland, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that. It was a fascinating conversation about his journey as an author, as well as his fandom for the spy genre and the James Bond films. So, without further ado, please welcome to the show, Roland Hulme. So joining me today for his second time on Selling Secrets, it's best-selling romance and adventure author, Roland Hulme. Roland, thank you very much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, and I'm super excited about this as a topic. This is something I'm really passionate about.
Absolutely. Well, who better to talk about film and book adaptations than an author himself? So I thought definitely you'd be the right person to get on and actually talk to it, because while I have a film background, you're the man who's writing the novels and the stories and can actually speak to successful books. So I'm really excited to get into this one with you.
And I'm kind of excited because the telling stories through a book and telling stories through a film, they're two different skills, except I like one book in particular, High Point, I wrote, and people said it reads like a screenplay, whereas other books tend to be more introspective, and that's maybe why they're so more difficult to adapt.
Absolutely. And then you've got the whole visual medium of film as well, which is so starkly different to the stories, because you'll sit on an image for a couple of seconds, whereas you can take 2 pages to explain the landscape that you find the characters in, or the detail of the house, whereas that might be a brief in an actual film, right?
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, I thought we'd start by discussing the elements of what actually makes a successful book-to-film adaptation. Now, when I say successful, I'm not necessarily talking monetarily, right? Like, I more want to lean into the angle of what is a successful story and film and what audiences like, because normally as a marketing professional, like, I would look at the money and go, okay, well, let's say something like The Hobbit, that was a successful film money-wise, and it did really well in selling tickets. I don't think it's an accurate metric, though, to look at when we're actually looking at adaptations, right? Because if you look at the top 10 highest grossing, book-to-film adaptations on Box Office Mojo, like, I'd argue that a lot of these aren't necessarily successful in terms of like adapting their source material, right?
I think that's a really legit way of looking at it. I know it's a comic book rather than a book, but they did the version of Constantine with Keanu Reeves, and then that was like egregious in terms of being a successful adaptation to your standards, except it was a box office hit. People still seem to love it. They're even talking about making a sequel. So I wouldn't think of that as a successful adaptation, even though it was a box office success.
Absolutely. Well, if you look at those top 10 adaptations, this is from last year, 2021, so it may slightly vary now, but your top 10 movies that are book to film adaptations that have been financially successful. You've got Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 at number 1, Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, both which I would say are pretty successful on both metrics. Then you get Jurassic Park, then Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, which, let's not go there. The Hobbit and Unexpected Journey, which I think, like as I said before, it's a trash fire adaptation of an incredible book. Then Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Harry Potter are in here quite a lot. The Jungle Book, which is the Jon Favreau one from a couple of years ago. Hobbit, Battle of the Five Armies, again, terrible. And then Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. So I don't think that's really necessarily a good metric to look at, right? Because if you look at the top 10 rated book to film adaptations on IMDb, that's like starkly different. Like you've got Shawshank. They're pretty much the only ones that stay the same are those Lord of the Rings adaptation. Like number 1's The Shawshank Redemption. Number 2 is Return of the King. Number 3 is Fellowship of the Ring. Then we go to Forrest Gump, then The Two Towers, then The Green Mile, Clockwork Orange, Shutter Island, A Beautiful Mind, and No Country for Old Men. Like none of them made money, like other than Lord of the Rings. It's so different. I'd be interested to get your perspective as to why you think there's such a massive discrepancy there.
It's funny because when you think about that, the ones that I thought the Hunger Games or the Twilight series was pretty loyal adaptation. I mean, people don't think about that as sort of serious stuff because they're like, oh, it's Twilight. But actually, I thought that was a really well done movie adaptation of the Twilight series. And I'm surprised. I think people sometimes overlook those ones, but there are books that maybe aren't considered as worthy that end up becoming very financially successful and from a storytelling success, good adaptations.
Well, 50 Shades of Grey. I think that's a prime example there. Like, say what you will about those books, but the films, I think, were quite good adaptations in terms of being quite loyal to the source material, and also they improved on the books. Like, I think the films were remarkably better, whilst not necessarily being good films. They were better than the books, right?
Yeah. Oh, and it's interesting because, if you'd cast someone ugly as Christian Grey instead of a romance film, it would have been like an episode of NCIS or.
Well, you're coming to this from a romance novelist perspective, right? I mean, what were your thoughts on those adaptations? Have you seen the films?
I've watched all of the Twilight ones. I've only watched the first 50 Shades of Grey, but I went to the movie theater to watch that. I'm not going to lie. And I thought it was a very loyal adaptation. And I think it brought out some of the creepiness of it and some of the ridiculousness of it. But I thought it was pretty much a very good adaptation.
Likewise. Well, I think talking about what makes a good adaptation, right? Maybe let's delve into that a little bit, because for every Casino Royale, for every 3 Days of the Condor or Born Identity, there's a Casino Royale 1967 or a Never Say Never Again. So maybe before we start getting into what we think is a successful adaptation or maybe not a successful adaptation, let's go through, I guess, maybe some ground rules and some key elements that make for a successful adaptation. And I've jotted these down, and I'd like to get your thoughts on each of them as well. But the first point was, does it stay truthful to the source material? The second being, what does the film do better than the novel? The third, if it moved away from the source material, why didn't that work? Or why did that work? Does the fan base of the novel like the adaptation regardless of the changes made? And finally, should the film adaptation have added more of the novel to make it work better? So those were sort of the 5 points that I had jotted down. But do you think that's sort of a good jumping off point for us to get into this? I wouldn't call it a debate, more of a discussion.
Absolutely. And I think that first one's really interesting because when it's truthful to the source material, it doesn't necessarily need to be literally true. But I think it has to have the spirit of it being true, because sometimes you can make quite significant changes to the plot. I'm thinking of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. They made some changes to the plot that were quite significant, but it was true to the spirit of it all. And so fans still embraced it.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, personally for me, my favorite of the Harry Potter films. It's incredibly well made. Who directed that? That was... It's going to completely escape my mind now.
I know. I was just thinking, and it's someone kind of significant. It wasn't Guillermo del Toro, but it was somebody who, from an interesting background,
was originally attached to direct it from memory, and that may be why. Alfonso Cuarón, that's who it was. So hence why I love it, because I love Children of Men and basically anything he's ever done.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, let's maybe start talking about what makes a successful adaptation. And now, obviously, this podcast, I talk about action movies, spy films, and James Bond. Obviously, I'm a massive Bond fan, so I thought we could look at this through the lens of the James Bond universe and look at 2 Bond novel to film adaptations. One that I think is globally regarded as one of the best Bond films of all times, but in my opinion, is probably better than the novel, and then one that maybe isn't as well regarded and definitely didn't stick to the source material. So let's start off with the first. We're talking 1964's Goldfinger. Can you tell me your overall thoughts of the film before we sort of get into it?
I absolutely adore that film. That is up there in my probably top 3 James Bond films of all time. I think everything about it was perfect. And to me, if you want to have the classic quintessential Bond film to show somebody, that's the one.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you on that. It's such an iconic film. You know, we did have a couple of Bond films prior to it, but it really laid, I guess, what did you call it, the groundwork for the Bond formula, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, it was the third installment of the Bond franchise. For those who haven't seen it, and if you're listening to this podcast, I highly doubt that you haven't seen it. But maybe we go into, I guess, the story a little bit first, and then we break it down based on the novel and those 5 points that we had laid out. So the film's plot has James Bond investigating a gold smuggling ring by gold magnate Auric Goldfinger, and eventually uncovering Goldfinger's plans to contaminate the United States bullion depository at Fort Knox. So that's a very, very brief and short synopsis, but I think that gives us a good idea there. It was the first Bond blockbuster with a budget equal to that of the 2 preceding films. It was the most successful Bond film to date, obviously, out of the first 3. So with that being said, let's look at Fleming versus the film, because I think we can both say we love it. First of all, does the Goldfinger film stay truthful to its novel source material? You go first.
Well, I mean, I would say it absolutely does, but more follows the spirit than necessarily the literal truth. But I mean... Yeah, it really does in so many different ways. It has to cut out some, because in the novel you have Bond meeting somebody he's met before, Monsieur Dupont from Casino Royale. That was too much exposition to put in. So in the movie, they kind of like slipstream through that. But most of the key beats in him meeting Goldfinger, in meeting Jill Masterson, and then being sent on this assignment, and so much of it is very, very... loyal to the spirit of the book, but they do make some fundamental changes that we'll talk about in the next point that
absolutely. And I agree with you on that. I think that's what makes probably overall, for me at least, a successful novel to film adaptation, wherein it doesn't necessarily need to stay word for word accurate to the books. And I think that's something you find maybe when you have an author writing their own screenplay, is that they might stay too close to the source material. And you found that maybe with films where, like, I'm trying to think of something as an example, maybe the Jack Reacher novels, where Lee Child was highly involved in the first film, and then, wasn't involved with the films, but was heavily involved with the series. And that worked because Lee Child obviously had a big influence over the series, whereas the film didn't. I'm trying to think of maybe one that's a better example there. So point number 2, what does the film do better than the novel?
And that's interesting because Goldfinger as a novel, I have a love-hate relationship with, so to speak. It's one of the ones that means the most to me because from an effort of writing, I think it's beautiful. The stories and the characters and the meals and the travel, I think it's just such a rich and evocative book. But like, it's the worst example of Fleming just not having a solid plot or a solid foundation for a plot. And it all kind of falls apart at the end. And I remember reading it with him being on a train trying to take all this gold away from Fort Knox and other trains going in different directions. I was like, this is just stupid. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then in the movie, they just solve it. The whole idea of putting a dirty nuclear bomb in Fort Knox to irradiate the gold. I'm like, that's genius. They solved the plot problem that Ian Fleming wrote himself into. And they did it so elegantly. And they made it just tied everything together so much stronger through that. And it's kind of one of those, well, yeah, that's definitely a case where they improved the plot and the structure of the stories significantly.
No,
well, it's still at the same time, like, keeping loyal to, like, the stuff that we loved about Fleming with the characters and the meals and the luxuriousness.
I definitely agree with you on that. And I think what it did better, speaking of like the meals and maybe the travelogue aspect, Fleming does go into such great detail about that sort of stuff. And I don't think that would necessarily relate directly to the film as well, right? Like, you don't want to sit there seeing James Bond eating his eggs and bacon or his scrambled eggs. So being able to have that travelogue feel where you're going to these, at the time at least, exotic locations in Europe and the United States and getting to see Kentucky, I think in the film it felt a little bit more, not authentic or believable, but it was just more efficient. And I think that was a really successful part of the adaptation as well, because it didn't get bogged down in the semantics of maybe what Fleming had in the book as well, right?
Agreed.
If it moved away from the source material, though, is there an element of that didn't work that you can think of off the top of your head?
I think reading the book, there were some of the things they had to cut for the movie were delightful in terms of, like, the intimacy of it, having a reoccurring character like Monsieur Dupont and having the dinner with Goldfinger in his house with the cat being eaten by Oddjob, and having Oddjob with his big, like, his arms and hands being like callous pieces of meat. Those are all, like, delicious elements that you get in the book that you couldn't really have in the source in the movie, I think, in the same way. But I think to a certain extent you lost some of the grand guignol of it all, some of the really grisly and delicious and sadistic stuff that you love about the best of the Fleming books.
Agreed. And talking about Oddjob and how you think of him in the film, right? He's such an iconic henchman, but then in the book it expands on him so much more, being that really, I guess, is sadistic the best, right? It's a bit of a racial stereotype from the time, with the eating of the cat and the Asians, and that's, I guess, you can look at that as a positive move, that they didn't necessarily stereotype the Asian as a cat eater, but at the same time, when you're reading that on the page, it does, right, have that such a sadistic and evil feeling to it.
Yeah, and I think also with Pussy Galore and stuff, Pussy Galore was a gang leader, and she was called Pussy Galore because she was a lesbian. And her gang, the Cement Mixers, were like a lesbian all-girl gang, which is kind of an interesting idea. And I think he did it because it was like salacious. But at the same time, it's strangely empowering until he cures her lesbianism. It's kind of like strangely empowering to have a very strong, capable female character who like holds her own against Goldfinger.
And I think that's something that the book did better than the film, because the film, whilst Honor Blackman is just the pinnacle of Bond girls and she's just absolutely gorgeous, I think, she comes across, I'm a damn good pilot. That's almost like the maximum, like the zenith of, is it the right word? The zenith of her
that's
strength.
A good word, actually.
Yeah. And, you know, her girls, her pilot girls, they're all in their skimpy pilot's outfits where you can see the outlines of their chest and their curves. It doesn't really come across that she's, you know, a hardened criminal that's just, she's in it because she's Goldfinger's pilot. I think the book did that better, for me at least.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And then, interestingly, in the Anthony Horowitz continuation novel, Trigger Mortis, which carries on from the novel of Goldfinger, Bond is shackled right after with her. Yeah, absolutely. And it expands on her character as well. And I think it fixes the Bond curing her lesbianism element, because she ends up leaving Bond and going off with one of the girls from the novel, and they end up riding off into the sunset and leaving Bond. And I think that was a very good way of fixing something that wasn't necessary, that was problematic.
Absolutely. And also, we always want to know how these relationships end. Bond's probably like, oh my God, how sad. Anyway.
Pretty much. So, does the fan base of the novel love the adaptation regardless of the changes made?
Well, I think you and I are the fan base of the novel, and I think we love the adaptation even more than the novel.
Agreed. I mean, obviously, I'm not sure about you, but I came to the Bond franchise from the films and then went to the books. So I think that's probably a clear indication that it was a successful adaptation, because it's had such longevity for, you know, me born in the 1990s coming back and watching the film, not having even read the book and going, I love this. And then going back and reading the book and still maintaining that the film is such a masterpiece, right?
It really is. And I find it interesting. I try and force feed my kids Bond, of course. And normally, you know, they're good with like the Pierce Brosnan ones, which is when you have the more modern style of storytelling. Goldfinger they liked and they watched and they were like really invested in, which I was really happy about. So I think, again, even in a period in which a lot of the movies are quite lethargic, Goldfinger still holds up.
Absolutely. And they were doing a bit of a run of all the old Bond films in the lead up to No Time to Die, prior to COVID, when all the lockdown stuff happened here. And I said to my fiance, right, if there's one Bond film that you're going to watch, like, she's not a massive Bond fan. She'll watch them if I'm watching them, but she has no real interest in them. I said to her, if there's one film that you watch and that you need to understand why it's had such a cultural impact, it's Goldfinger. So we went and saw that on the big screen, and she went, yeah, I actually really enjoyed that. Like, it's a good film, and it's a good classic film, regardless of, you know, the history or anything like that. And then it just goes to show how I said before, it paved the groundwork for the franchise to come.
Absolutely.
Where in the book it may not have, I don't think you necessarily, there was a very successful book of its time, but I don't think it paved the groundwork for, you know, a massive franchise to come that made, you know, billions of dollars.
No, and I think it's one of the books that's lower in the ranks out of all of them. I don't necessarily think it's like the worst, so to speak, but it's certainly one of the bottom ones.
Well, what's, out of curiosity, what's your least favorite of the Fleming novels?
So that's a really good question, because I love and hate Goldfinger at the same time. So maybe I would even actually put Goldfinger at the bottom, just because it has like some structural things. But then again, it's so delicious, and it's like The Man with the Golden Gun you think might be the lowest, except I think the story holds together and it's kind of like interesting. So maybe The Man with the Golden Gun is probably the worst, but Goldfinger is probably the second worst, I think.
Interesting. This probably doesn't count, but I'd put maybe the some of the short stories lower. Simple, like Quantum of Solace. Whilst it's a really interesting experiment, it's not really a Bond story, is it?
Yeah, and it's difficult though, because when you have experiments, it's like you can't really compare them against each other. Whereas with Bond movies, because it is the Bond formula, you can do that. And it's only something like No Time to Die that really throws a wrench into the works, because that like leaves the formula dramatically. And so people
majorly.
Like, okay, don't know where to put that one. But the other ones, you can pretty easily stack them up just from how successfully they do the things you know a Bond movie is meant to do.
Absolutely. And You Only Live Twice. Sorry, I should say. I've completely just gone and spoiled what I was about to say. No Time to Die is a form of adaptation, or very loose adaptation of You Only Live Twice. It definitely leans heavily on some of the literary elements from that novel.
Actually, I think that's a very good segue into what you were going on to next, because there are Bond films that recycle elements from less successful adaptations, so to speak.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into our next one, which is the unsuccessful Bond book to film adaptation. And for those who aren't aware, I do love this film. It was one of my first, but it definitely isn't the strongest Bond film, and that's 1979's Moonraker. Roland, what's your overall feelings towards the Moonraker film?
I'm with you 100%. I mean, I love it as a movie. I think it's such fun. I think it's so wonderful. It is really one of the Bond movies that buttons down the formula of what a Bond movie is. I think it's almost a play-by-play remake of The Spy Who Loved Me, which is another adaptation that has nothing to do with the books, although that was on Fleming's insistence. But Moonraker is a wonderful movie, and it's a wonderful product of its time. But yeah, as an adaptation, it is a travesty, because Moonraker is one of the best Bond books, and it has very, very few of the elements. I mean, it's practically unrelated, and yet it's still a good movie.
Definitely. I agree with you on that. And speaking of before we get into it, you said The Spy Who Loved Me. That you couldn't adapt that book into a film. There is just nothing to do with James Bond in that, other than a couple of elements. It's one of those experiments that are just so outlandish compared to the formula, right? It's a very different book.
Yes, and I mean, it would actually maybe make an interesting film or an interesting mini-series, but it's not Bond, so you wouldn't have it as a Bond film.
Well, maybe Amazon can do that now they have the rights. We could get a Spy Who Loved Me mini-series. I can see that. That'd be cool. All right, so Moonraker the film, though. So it was the third and final film directed by Lewis Gilbert. As you said, it is almost a play-by-play remake of Spy Who Loved Me, the film, and Gilbert did You Only Live Twice as well, right?
I think he did, yeah.
Yeah, and it's those films, they all follow a very set formula, right? There's the inciting incident where the bad guys capture the space, or the submarine. In Moonraker's case, obviously, it's a space shuttle. And then, Bond goes on and finds the megalomaniac. And then in the final act, there's a big battle between everyone. And Bond obviously defeats the villain, who isn't necessarily a physical threat to him. So they all definitely follow a real set pattern there. I think those three Lewis Gilbert films. I think, though, obviously talking the novel, I think Fleming had intended that the film would be based on the novel, right? He did a screenplay, manuscript, all this sort of stuff. But then Cubby Broccoli decided, no, we need to chase current trends. And this is, I think, where Bond went from being ahead of the curve and being something that was setting trends to something from here on in. We're always chasing different genres and chasing different, trying to chase the thing of the time, right? And that thing for Moonraker was Star Wars. That was a massive film of its time. Do you think that was a good choice, that they just completely departed from the novel and went after the trends?
I think Moonraker, I think in some ways we are lucky that Moonraker wasn't a strict adaptation because it meant we got the movie Moonraker, which we love. But at the same time, it was one of the pinnacle moments in the James Bond franchise where from that point on, every film that followed it seemed to be led with, we're going back to Fleming's source material. It's like Fiore's Only was much truer to Fleming's source material when they did... View to a Kill and Octopussy are bad examples. But the Living Daylights. We're going back to Fleming's Bond, and then with especially I think with some of the Pierce Brosnan movies, it was like, we're going back to the original Fleming as the source material. Then Daniel Craig, we're going back to Fleming. It seemed like Moonraker was really the most outlandish it got, and then they were trying to rein it in at every point.
And they would always get to that outlandish point and then reel it back, and then get to that outlandish point and reel it back. And one of the ones we're going to touch on, I think that's a prime example of that, is Pierce Brosnan's Die Another Day, which I think is a more true adaptation to the novel than what the Moonraker film is. So touching on the novel, though, obviously it's the third novel that Fleming wrote. It's my personal favorite. It was It was published in the 1950s. I think it was 1955 or 56. And the plot actually was derived from a screenplay, believe it or not. A little bit like, I'm going to say Thunderball, but it doesn't have the same legal issues that Thunderball did, right? But it follows more a set story where Bond, he encounters a villain who's cheating, playing bridge of all things. He's then, this villain's, an industrialist. He's not a villain. He's a hero, and everyone thinks he's the best in the world. That he's developing this missile technology for the United Kingdom, and he's going to put them into the world sphere of being a superpower again. But he has to go and investigate because there's some mysterious things going on at Drax's research facility. And it then turns out that Drax is actually not who he seems. He's actually an ex-Nazi and plans to actually arm the rocket that he's developing for the British with a nuclear warhead and then fire it at London. You compare that to the film, Bond does encounter Drax, and Drax is, an industrialist who is well regarded in the community. He's building spaceships for NASA instead. But it turns out that he's actually just a crazy megalomaniac who wants to destroy the world and repopulate with a master race on space stations. So there's a massive difference between the two, while still sticking to a bit of a loose source material. So I guess that gets into point number one. Does the Moonraker film stay true to the original source material?
I think that's really interesting because Die Another Day, as you mentioned, it is almost, if you describe it, it's like there is a wealthy industrialist who makes diamonds who everyone loves, but he cheats. And that's how James Bond he cheats at fencing rather than cards, but that's how Bond gets in there. They even go to Blades as a club. And it turns out that he's not who he says he is. He is somebody who's pretending to be somebody else through, just in the same way Drax in the book, like his face was all mangled up from the war, so he was able to disguise himself as somebody else, and that's what Gustav Graves did. All of the elements, from a very broad perspective, are the storyline of Moonraker.
Absolutely. I wish Die Another Day. I love Die Another Day, but I wish it was such a better film because it has such potential using that source material, right?
Yeah, Die Another Day, it will always hold a special place in my heart because of where I was when that movie happened. But I mean, objectively, you have to look at it. It's the odd one out of Brosnan's movies.
It's a product of its times, much like Moonraker is. Moonraker, you could say, is the odd one out of Roger's films. They're both that outlandish film. But in saying that, as much as I love the novel, I reckon there are things that the film does better than the novel. You start first, but are there any elements that you think that the film does better than the novel?
That's very interesting. I I mean, I guess from a Bond perspective, the novel is all set in Britain and England. It's a very claustrophobic novel, which I enjoy. And it literally doesn't really have a romance angle to it because Gala Brand, ends up being engaged to somebody else. And I think they have like one closed mouth kiss and that's about it. So the elements that people love about Bond movies do not exist in the book. Whereas Moonraker is like, okay, you're off to Venice, you're off to Rio, you're off to space. And then we're going to throw so many girls at you. And don't worry, they're all disposable. We'll get them eaten by dogs or whatever. And it's got the entire world-ending plot. Whereas Moonraker, I think the stakes were pretty high with like a nuclear bomb going off in London. But it's like when you're talking about the extinction of the human race.
It's much different.
Yeah, but the whole idea of like the master race and the people who survive, that was interesting because that whole Nazism element was to a certain extent the same as Sir Hugo Drax.
Yeah, I agree with you there because dropping a nuke on London was essentially just revenge for the war, right? It wasn't really much of other than a Nazi plot. It was just, we're going to destroy the people who ruined our lives. Whereas, you could say that it was probably one of Hitler's plans was to have spacecraft and all those sort of things and build the master race. So I agree with you there. I think that's
now
one
really interesting element about the book, though, is it was written in 1950. Well, it was published in 1955, and the interesting thing was with the space program. My 13-year-old is obsessed with space, so he told me about this. Basically, NASA were like, "Hey, you Nazis, why don't you come work for us? Operation Paperclip," I thought they called it. So they got some legitimately horrible people who did some really sketchy, bad, evil things, and they just brought them over and gave them beautiful lives in America. And I can't remember the name of him, but the person in charge of a lot of the rocket programs, like when he was operating in Germany during the era of the Nazis, he was responsible for literally like killing people and hanging people. And then suddenly he was NASA's best friend, and we hail him as kind of hero these days. And so that was something that all of these German soldiers in disguise, the Nazi running the program, that was actually something that had some shadow of truth to it. And in 1955, I think we look back at it and we're like, oh yeah, of course all the people in the rocket programs were Nazis. Whereas in 1955, I don't think the general population realized that the people behind all of the Nazi rocket programs were former Nazis. Well, yeah, all of the American and British rocket programs were former Nazis.
They were all brought over to the US under new identities and given new lives, and it was a very different thing. I mean, the CIA obviously had or was it the OSS back in those days? I can't remember when the CIA was founded, but they were all Soviets and Nazis, and there was an inkling probably, but definitely, I don't think the general population had an idea, and Fleming was definitely ahead of his time with that, right?
Yeah. And as a journalist, he wasn't afraid of speaking truth. So I wonder if there's like a bit of a subversive element in that book that I'm surprised no one really harped on more at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've talked about what the film has done better than the novel. Now, it definitely, to point 3, moved away from the source material. Why didn't that work? Obviously, we've touched on the point that it's a totally different story for one, but also it was chasing the trends of the time. But is there anything that, because it moved away from the source material, you think didn't work?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really appealing about Moonraker as a book was there was the intimacy of it. There was almost like a mystery element to it. There were, again, the delicious Fleming touches of, all of these rocket scientists with these big, ridiculous moustaches and their shaved heads. And Bond is right in the midst of them and then figures out the plot. All of those things were really delightful parts of the book and would have made a very self-contained movie. And we just throw them all out. And it's not that Moonraker, the movie, is a bad movie. It's got a very Bond plot that works, but it's just we miss having a loyal adaptation, and I think it would have been something really enjoyable.
Well, they ditched those, and those you could say in the novel are the typical Bond henchmen, the rocket scientists with the mustaches and the bald heads. Like, there would have been it would have been ridiculous in the film to have that, but it would have been a very iconic look that we didn't get, and instead we got Jaws come back because kids love Jaws, and we've got to bring Jaws back somehow from the previous film, right?
Exactly. I don't think you could have like put the brakes on after The Spy Who Loved Me and then suddenly had a super intimate story set in England with these things. I think you could do a streaming movie of it version and now set, in the contemporary times. But in terms of the James Bond franchise, where it was in the late 70s, it's like, no, these elements aren't bombastic enough.
Well, it's very similar and very close almost to the book is very similar and close to Dr. No, how in regards he's a policeman a bit more, he's investigating, he's doing quite mundane activities, and he has to escape the boiling hot water and all those sort of things, and there's the steam of the rocket and all of that, where he gets burnt quite badly and disfigured. So there's a lot of parallels between the Dr. No novel and the Moonraker novel, and I don't think you could have gone back to the Dr. No film in terms of him being just a policeman and investigating. As you said, it's got to progress once you've gone that bombastic route that the previous film did, right?
Yeah, and I think Moonraker, the book, it had a lot of similarities with fiction of the time. It makes me think of The Saint, the Leslie Charteris's Saint stories, which were, again, kind of like that intimate procedural detective solving things, solving puzzles, finding out who the bad guy is, having that betrayal. And it was very much a product of the 50s. And then, in the 70s, just the where they were in cinema, those weren't the stories that got told anymore.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you there. Does the fan base so this is a bit of an icky subject, because David Zaritsky on his podcast recently was actually talking about this, how there used to be a bit of a separation in the Bond community between the literary Bond fans, the film Bond fans, the fans of the sartorial aspect, whereas now everyone's sort of come together a little bit more, right? But there are definitely still lines in the sand between, the fans of the novels versus the fans of the films. Does the fan base of the novel love the adaptation, regardless of the changes made?
I think that's it, because I would consider Moonraker, the novel, one of my favorites, and yet I still love the movie. So I don't consider it successful, though. But I still enjoy what we got. And you're right, though. There is, like, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, to me, is like the perfect movie adaptation of a Bond book, because it stays loyal to it and yet still has all of the elements we love in a Bond movie. So could you have done that with Moonraker? I don't think so. But I think given what they had to do, they did a pretty serviceable job. I don't know. It's one of these things. I have cognitive dissonance. I managed to love both. And I managed to embrace both, even though they contradict each other.
Well, I agreed. I love Moonraker. It was one of the first I saw. Being a young kid, it was sort of one of the more tame ones that I was allowed to watch. So it has a very special place in my heart. But I think overall, and you look at all the top 10 lists, or in the world of Bond, the top 25 lists, it never really ranks as high. So I definitely don't think it has that. You compare it to Casino Royale or Goldfinger, it definitely doesn't have that same love in the Bond community overall as what, say, those ones do. You speak of OHMSS, and that for me is another great example of an adaptation that was better than the novel. In the novel, especially when Bond's going to assault Piz Gloria, he's scared of going back to the mountain because he's scarred of his time there, and he puts Tracy into a hotel and leaves her and goes off to face Blofeld. Whereas in the film, he's Tracy's held captive. He has motivation. He has to not only go and save the world and face the villain, but he has to rescue his bride-to-be. I think it's a much, much more improved upon the formula. Would you agree with that?
I 100% agree with that. And I think you nailed why it works better. And it's this thing in storytelling. It's very, very important. It's like your hero or heroine, whatever motivates them to take action, it must be a need, not a want. And so in the books, James Bond wanted to fulfill his orders and go and stop Blofeld. Whereas in the movie, because Tracy had been kidnapped, it was a need. And also it made, Diana Rigg is the pinnacle of Bond girls to me.
Yeah.
Like, I had a crush on Diana Rigg from the Avengers. And then I saw her in that, and she just perfection, the most beautiful, classy, elegant, tough, brilliant, independent. And the movie managed to do all that. She like became, to me, the pinnacle of Bond girls because she could look after herself.
And she's the only girl who could get through to Bond and eventually, humanize him. Whereas in the book, she is a little bit of I'm not going to say an arranged marriage, but there's definitely some problematic elements of their relationship compared to the film, right?
Yes. And I think Diana Rigg, just like Honor Blackman, who we mentioned earlier, kind of brought in the character they played in the Avengers into this. But there were some scenes, Telly Savalas as well is the best Blofeld. And when she's kind of like flirting with Blofeld a bit and doing him, she's not flirting really, but she's kind of like beguiling him. And I'm like, that's brilliant. That's what we want in our Bond girls. We want them to be able to
smarts.
Yeah. And use their femininity as effectively.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Well, back onto Moonraker though. Should the film adaptation have added more of the book, and would have that made it more of a successful adaptation?
I guess, but I think, to be honest, I wouldn't want to desecrate Moonraker as a movie by screwing around with it. I'm like, kinda, yeah, but we'll let it pass. We'll let it go this time.
For me, at least, I think they could have added. I don't think the Bond girl in the film, your final Bond girl, I've completely mind blanked on her name now.
Holly Goodhead. Holly Goodhead.
Goodhead, my goodness. I don't think she's as strong as the lead in the novel. You compare her to Gala Brand, right? Gala Brand's she's a resourceful police officer for the special branch. She's independent. Whilst Goodhead is like that, she ends up falling for Bond's charms and they end up sleeping together, and it goes on that Bond formula, whereas Gala Brand sticks to her guns and she goes, I could run off with you into the sunset and I could see us living together, but I have a life outside of this, and just because we've spent time together saving the world doesn't mean I am now betrothed to you. I think that made her a much more believable character, I think, is the best way for it.
I remember that in the book, it was a very formative relationship for me, because I was like, I like this whole thing of the hero doesn't always get the girl. That works for me.
Absolutely. And I think also if they had have included elements of Bond getting beaten and scarred and like almost losing in Moonraker, like he almost loses everything in the novel. Whereas in the film, Roger barely looks like he breaks a sweat. I think if they had have added those little, going back to Fleming elements, I reckon it could have been Roger's masterpiece. I reckon and people wouldn't have looked at him as the silly Bond as much if they just had have lent into the darker elements of the novel a little bit more.
Yeah, and there are some things in the movie. There is the bit where he's like, oh, I'm an astronaut. Oh, yeah, Holly Goodhead's like, I'm an astronaut. He goes, oh, a woman. Even then, even in the 70s, it's like you actually had female astronauts in the 70s. So it's kind of like that was a bit of sexism that was kind of like inserted in there, and it made James Bond look like a bit of a dick.
Yeah.
And Roger Moore managed to pull it off, but I'm like, I don't think the book Bond would have been like that. The book Bond respected Gala Brand as a police officer. He wasn't like, oh, she's a woman, she's useless.
Agreed. And I think there's probably a couple of elements of the film that I'd take out. Double taking pigeons aside.
Oh God, yeah.
The gondola. As much as that's a fun sequence, I think without such a ridiculous, dumb gadget, we could have done away with that.
Actually, and I watched Moonraker with my kids a little while ago, and you have to admit, if you sit down and kind of work out the plot of why Bond does this, why Bond goes here, they pencil in like, okay, this is the reasons why he goes to Venice, this is the reason why he goes to Rio and stuff, but only actually put together, you're like, these are ridiculous contrivances to get him to travel around the world. But then that's the Bond franchise. I mean, you watch Quantum of Solace and it's like ridiculous contrivances to send him on this adventure. So I see what you mean. Yeah, Moonraker hangs together as a book better that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we've gone through what we think are, I guess, a successful adaptation with Goldfinger, and then maybe a not so successful adaptation with Moonraker, despite the Moonraker film being one we both love as well. Based on these two examples, how do you think filmmakers and writers can look at them and successfully adapt a novel into a film and use them as a bit of a blueprint on how to do it or not, how not to do it?
I made a video about Reacher, actually. I think Reacher is the perfect example of this. And it's all about the concept. Why is the thing popular? Why is the book series popular? And you have to stay loyal to that when you make an adaptation. And I mean, Reacher is a great example. It's like the whole thing of Reacher is Jack Reacher is a freaking enormous mountain of a man who intimidates everyone who he meets just from his sheer size and his sheer implacable spirit. And when they made the movie adaptations, I mean, Tom Cruise is brilliant, but Tom Cruise he's a wee fella. He's a wee little fella, is Tom Cruise. So he didn't have that physicality. Whereas when they made the TV show, that was what they focused on. And I think an adaptation of anything, you have to drill it down to the very core concept of why is this thing compelling? And then you have to lean into that. It's like the Hunger Games, I thought was a very good adaptation. And it led into what made the Hunger Games compelling. Twilight, to be honest, yeah, very good adaptation of what it is because it led into what it was following. And when you don't lean into that, that's when you run into real problems. And I think, I can't remember if you've seen The Dark Tower or not, but that's one that I have real trouble with.
I haven't seen it, but go on to speak to that a little bit more.
Oh, so I mean, The Dark Tower is a movie inspired by, rather than based on, this wonderful series of 7 books Stephen King wrote over the course of like 20 years. We were terrified he was going to die before he finished them. It's all about Roland the Gunslinger, so obviously I was a little invested with that. And I loved those books, and they were incredible with the idea of these multiverses and these horrors that have flowed in all of Stephen King's other books. And they made a movie of it. And the thing that in the books, there was Roland the Gunslinger who looked like Clint Eastwood. And he was like a tall, white, rangy man. And then he had a sidekick from the 80s in New York called Eddie, and this wonderful African-American woman from the 70s who didn't have any legs. She was in a wheelchair. And then this kid, Jake. And when they made the movie of it, they recast the lead, Roland, into Idris Elba, who's a big black man who's fantastic. And he's actually really entertaining in this movie. He's really good in the movie. But doing that, they then stopped having Eddie and Odette as characters, or Susanna, that's the name, because she's got split personalities. But by taking those characters out, you don't have all of this wonderful byplay of the experiences they have with civil rights in the 70s and how this character of Susanna resents Roland because he's this old white man. And suddenly when you turn him into like a young, studly, handsome black man, it's like so many of the core elements of the book you just toss out of the window right away. And fans who've invested, as I said, 20 years reading these books are like, what the hell are you doing?
No, that's a really interesting. I'm going to have to watch it because I think I've read one of the Dark Tower novels. I haven't read all of them,
I mean, I will say this, because I watched the movie and I enjoyed the movie. I thought it was good. And my 13-year-old watched the movie with me. And afterwards, he was like, I want to read the books. And I was like, you know what? Maybe in some ways, this is a successful adaptation because it inspired him to want to read the books. And he's going to read the books, and I think they're going to love them. So maybe that's it. Maybe when you screw around with the elements, you're going to put the nose out of joint for fans who have been invested in the books for so long. But you might draw new people into it who enjoy the books for another reason.
Well, and that's the thing. I think a successful adaptation will bring more fans to the books. At the end of the day, that's what it's going to do. Whether it's a good adaptation, it's going to bring new fans and expand the genre as a whole, or expand that IP as a whole, I should say. Well, lastly, before we wrap up for today, I did want to ask you, what would your dream book to film adaptation be? Something that hasn't been done yet. What would you like to see come to the big screen?
I'm going to give the ultimate wanker answer to this. Just warning you right now. My dream book to film adaptation would be my book, High Point.
Yes.
I'm just going to say it right now. When I wrote it, I wrote it imagining it as a movie. And I had like Matthew McConaughey as the lead, and I had maybe Marissa Tomei as the heroine in it, and all of the characters. I could imagine it as a movie, and I wrote it as a movie. And I listen. When I write a book, I write 2,000 words in the morning, and then the rest of the day, I'm percolating tomorrow's 2,000 words in my head. So I listen to music, and I listen to movie soundtracks, and conjured up the images in my head. And so I think it would make a really amazing movie. I don't mind saying
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with you. And that's why I wanted to bring you on, because High Point is such a cinematic read. It's something that I've always, I loved reading that book. And McConaughey, I could see that, because have you seen the Clive Cussler adaptation of Sahara?
I have, and actually that was the song from that they opened that up with. I can't remember who it's by, but that I was thinking in my head in the opening scenes of High Point, it would be that song, and I could almost see it. He's like, it's reckless. I wanted to do something where the character of Max is the hero and have him be like implacable and get you done and not be rattled by stuff. And I wanted the heroine Tina, who is I imagine to being played by Marissa Tomei, to be like the hyper dramatic things and the way they played against each other. So I think the movie adaptation of Sahara, which is interesting because that isn't, again, a successful adaptation, still inspired me to want to write a story like this with a big sea voyage.
So that was one I was trying to think of earlier, where having the writer of the novel so heavily involved in the production of the film didn't work, because Clive Cussler, at every angle, I think when he sold the rights to that book, he had to be involved with the production, because he didn't like a previous adaptation of one of his other books. So he had to have final say on the script. And they kept butting heads with the producers, the filmmakers, and it ended up being just a trash fire, because they ended up going and making the film without consulting Cussler, because he was being such a dick, basically, because he wanted everything to be his way. And as a result, because he didn't gel with the filmmakers. I still love it. It's got its problems, but it's a great film. So
yeah, there are some really great scenes in that movie, I have to admit. And it's almost like Goldfinger the book has some really great scenes, but it doesn't hold together. Sahara the movie has some really great scenes, but it doesn't hold together.
Agreed. I think the sequence where they're sailing a car? It's been years since I've seen it.
I love that bit.
Sailing across the desert on a car or something. That was so cool.
Yeah, and I like the scene of, what is it they call it? We're going to pull a Panama, where they're having the fight scene on the boat.
Yes.
That was just brilliant.
And reading your book, when I first read High Point, that reminded me so much of that pulling a Panama sequence, like all the elements of the boat and all of that, his boss being like, look after my boat, bring my boat back, and the fun banter going on, that just totally reminded me of that. And that's without even having spoken to you. When I read High Point, I was picturing McConaughey in my head, because it evoked similar elements of that. So I sincerely hope that if there is a filmmaker listening to this, we get an adaptation of your book very soon, because that would be absolutely incredible. And
I always believe in setting ridiculously high objectives. So this year I'm going to ramp up my writing and my publishing to the next level, and I'm going to make that happen.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Definitely. Well, I'll say my dream, other than your book, my dream adaptation is Matthew Riley's Hover Car Racer. I know we spoke briefly about Matthew Riley last time you were on the podcast, but he was in the 2000s. He wrote this teen novel, and you could almost call it Harry Potter, but for racing. So it's about this kid who doesn't have much money, and he's like a really skilled hover car racer. So it's set in the near future where hover car technology is a thing, and he's got this old Formula One car that's been hobbled together with different parts, but he's a really skilled driver, and he ends up in this prestigious school for hover car racers, and he's a bit of an outsider, but he keeps beating everyone, and it's just such a cinematic read. And I know he sold the rights to Disney back when the book came out, but I think it lapsed. They didn't do anything with it. I think now more than ever, it would probably make a better series than a film, because of the way the book is structured. It's sort of structured over, years and seasons of his career. I think that would just make such a phenomenal adaptation. I really hope we get that someday.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but the way you describe it, it sounds like it would work really well, especially with like the school elements and stuff, because that's the reason why we keep having the school things. In fiction, you call it academy books, where you have a Hogwarts or something as the center of things. Spy School is a great series of kids' books. So that sounds like it would work really well.
And it's set in Australia. So like the school's I think it's in Tasmania in the book. So it's like you're listening to this and you're going, oh, I know that place. And like to be able to see there in my home on the screen would be very nice. So Roland, I know we were talking about your books, and last time we spoke on the podcast, you were developing a book that was almost a homage to the Bond franchise. Without giving too much away, where are you at in the process of writing that book?
Well, I'm percolating at the moment. I wrote quite a lot. I wrote I think even 10,000 words of that, and I paused for a sec because I want to get it completely right. I've spoken to Sean Longmore, who's the wonderful artist who does and about maybe getting him to do the covers for it, and I'm really kind of excited with that. But I think I might let that percolate and focus on knocking out a couple of shorter things, because I've taken a big break from writing for a while. I don't know, with writer's block, so I'm dipping my toes back in. So I'm going to write a very short, self-contained story that's going to be like a romance story involving bikers, because I think you need to get back into the spirit of things. But I'm so excited about this Bond adaptation, because I think the thing about romance books and the thing about James Bond books is their escapism, and you want to go on these wonderful adventures. And when you write them in the style of a romance novel, you get to write it and experience it at the same time. And
absolutely,
so I'm really excited to do that, and I really hope it does okay, because I would love to just write a series of spy romance novels that are all loving homages to each of the 25 movies.
Well, I know it'll do more than okay, because there's a huge community who are massive fans of your work. And if it's anything like what you've previously written, I can say that I'll love it. And I know a lot of other people will also love it. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you can come out with in the near future, because just can't say enough how much of a fan of your work I am. So I'm really excited for that.
Well, that is too kind. Lower your expectations.
Never. Always go into things with a high expectation and always be pleasantly surprised when it's better than what you expected. That's how I always look at things. Positivity always wins, Roland.
Absolutely. That's the words I live by.
Definitely. Well, let's wrap it up here. I just want to say thank you again for coming on the show and talking about this. I think this was a really unique topic to touch on, and I really appreciate your insights as a professional author. Where can people find you online to follow you and follow your work a little bit more?
Well, I write my romance novels under the name Simone Scarlett. But if you type in my name, Roland Hulme, I think Amazon page is the first place that comes up, and you'll see a lot of my romance books I'm repackaging with sort of male-friendly covers to have almost like a his and hers version, and I'm going to be rolling those out across the year. So if you like Sons of Anarchy or something like that, I think you're going to enjoy the series of books that I'm putting out.
Fantastic. Well, I'm very excited for that. And I'll put a link to your Amazon page as well as your fantastic YouTube channel as well in the show notes, because you touched on briefly your video that you did on Reacher, but I think some of the videos that you've been putting out on that YouTube channel have been absolutely fantastic and really insightful from a writer's perspective. So I highly recommend people check that out. And I think you're also doing a podcast. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I have a buddy who runs an ARC business. ARC stands for Advanced Reader Copy Service. So we give out books to readers before they get published, so we can actually get some reviews for them rolling off. And he does a wonderful podcast where he invites authors and people in, and I sort of produce that for him. It's called Fully Booked, and we've had some really interesting people in. We actually had Matt Spazer and Peter Brooker, who wrote From Tailors with Love. That was kind of interesting. Another one, we had Jen Milliken, who writes romance novels, she struck gold on TikTok and reached 16.5 million people. Her 4-year-old book went to #1 on Amazon, has an option to become a movie. And so we get to talk to some really interesting people about the business of writing and self-publishing and stuff. So that's called Fully Booked. And I'll shoot you a link so you can drop it down below. But if you're interested in writing and self-publishing, there's always a lot of value there.
Fantastic. Definitely. We'll make sure that there's links to that, because I think that's a fantastic resource for people. But Roland, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I look forward to talking with you again, because you've given me some ideas for some other topics that I think we can definitely delve into a little bit more. So thank you very much for coming on. This has been Selling Secrets Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Gay, and my guest today was Roland Hulme. Roland, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's always a blast.